Jonathan Reed had built an empire by ignoring anything that didn't bring profit, until the day he saw two boys feeding stray puppies with the only food they had. Jonathan Reed's mornings were never quiet. His life ran like a polished machine, guided by time blocks, assistants with tablets, and a luxury car waiting outside his private elevator. That morning was no different. His company had just acquired a fintech startup, and the buzz among investors had put his name on another magazine cover. He stepped out of his office building in a pressed navy suit, his dark hair combed into place, brown eyes scanning his phone as his driver pulled the car up to the curb. The sidewalk was buzzing with energy, interns rushing with coffee trays, professionals in tailored coats brushing past each other, and the rhythmic flow of a city that never paused. Jonathan didn't look up until something disrupted the order. On the edge of the building, in the narrow strip of shade between two pillars, two boys were crouched down with their backs to the street. At first, he assumed they were roughhousing or begging, and he nearly stepped past them. But something about their stillness made him stop. He turned his head just enough to see what they were doing. The older boy was breaking a sandwich into small pieces and placing them on a napkin in front of three tiny, dirty puppies. The younger one gently pushed a water bottle cap toward the smallest puppy, watching with careful concentration. Neither boy looked up, and neither spoke. Their movements were focused, calm, and deliberate. Their clothes were mismatched, faded, and several sizes too big. One wore sneakers with holes in both toes. The other had a torn sleeve held together with a safety pin. But what caught Jonathan most was not the state of their appearance, it was the way they gave up their food so freely. The sandwich looked like it might be their only one, and yet they weren't eating. They were feeding the dogs. He stood there for several moments, uncertain why he hadn't already walked away. People were glancing at him, and his driver was waiting, but for once, Jonathan felt no urgency. He slowly approached, the sound of his polished shoes catching the boys' attention. They turned toward him at the same time. Both had soft brown hair, windblown and uncombed. Their eyes were striking, icy blue and wide with awareness, not fear. The older one instinctively moved closer to the puppies, shielding them, while the younger stayed still. Jonathan cleared his throat. "Why are you feeding them?" he asked, expecting a defensive response or maybe silence. Instead, the older boy looked straight at him and answered with a voice too calm for his age. "They don't have a mom. Just like us." Jonathan felt something unsteady shift inside his chest. The answer wasn't rehearsed or emotional. It was a simple fact spoken from a place of quiet understanding. He didn't know what to say next. For a man who spent his life crafting perfect statements, managing crises, and negotiating deals, he suddenly felt unequipped. The boys turned their attention back to the puppies, gently stroking their heads and whispering encouragement as the little animals nibbled on crumbs. A gust of wind swept through the space between the buildings, and the younger boy shivered, pulling his thin jacket tighter. Jonathan reached into his pocket and took out his leather gloves, hesitating before extending them. "Where are you staying?" he asked. This time, the younger one spoke, his voice soft. "Sometimes a basement. Or the bus stop. Depends if it's raining." He had heard enough. Something in him, the part he'd long buried beneath meetings, margins, and market growth, told him he couldn't walk away. And for the first time in years, Jonathan Reed listened. Jonathan didn't go to the car. He didn't look back at his assistant waving from the doorway, or at the driver who had stepped out to open the door. Instead, he knelt slowly, careful not to startle the boys or the puppies. The older boy watched him with quiet suspicion, clearly unsure whether this stranger was going to scold them or worse. Jonathan spoke in a low, even voice, trying not to sound like the executive he usually was. "What are your names?" The younger boy answered first, hesitantly. "I'm Lee." "That's my brother, Noah." The older one gave a slight nod but said nothing. Jonathan looked at the three puppies now curled up beside them, their ribs visible under matted fur. Are they yours? He asked. They're nobody's, Noah finally said. So we decided to be their somebody. The honesty of that answer struck Jonathan harder than he expected. He looked at their faces, tired, smudged with dirt, but steady. These weren't kids looking for pity. They were surviving in a world that hadn't given them anything, and somehow they still had enough heart to feed animals with less than they had themselves. Jonathan slowly pulled his wallet from his coat, removed a business card, and offered it. If I got you some food, for all of you, would you come with me? Just to eat. Somewhere warm. No tricks. Lee looked at Noah, who seemed to weigh every possible danger before nodding once. As long as we can bring the puppies, Noah said firmly. We won't leave them. Of course, Jonathan said. All of you. He led them to a cafe just around the corner, one he often used for quiet meetings. It was upscale but empty at that hour, and the staff knew better than to question him. They entered hesitantly, the boys' eyes darting around as though they didn't belong. Jonathan took a booth in the back, far from the windows. The manager started to approach, but a sharp glance from Jonathan made him retreat. A server brought menus, but the boys just stared at them. Can we get food without paying first? Lee asked in a whisper. Jonathan nodded. You're my guests. Order anything. They ordered modestly despite the opportunity, grilled cheese, soup, a few sides. Jonathan ordered extra just in case. When the food came, the boys didn't eat right away. Instead, they checked the floor under the table, made sure the puppies were comfortable, then finally took their first bites. They didn't speak while they ate. It wasn't fear or rudeness, it was hunger. Real hunger. The kind that fills silence with focus. Jonathan didn't touch his own plate. When they were halfway through, he leaned forward and spoke again. Where are your parents? There was no anger or pressure in his tone. Just quiet concern. Noah paused and then looked straight at him. Our mom died last year. She tried, but it got too hard. There wasn't anyone after that. Lee added softly, we were in a place, but it was bad. We ran away. Jonathan asked, what kind of place? A shelter, Noah said. But the other kids, and the people, it didn't feel safe. Not for us. And not for the dogs. Jonathan leaned back, trying to steady the wave of anger that rose in him, not at the boys, but at the system that had failed them. Children like this weren't supposed to fall through the cracks. Not in a city like his. Not on his watch. But they had. And now they were here, sitting across from him, asking for nothing but space to breathe and kindness for 3 stray animals. By the time the plates were clean, the boys looked less rigid, more grounded. Their eyes were still guarded, but there was trust beginning to form at the edges. Jonathan reached for his phone under the table, typed a message to his assistant, cancel all meetings for the day. Then he put the phone away, looked at the boys, and said, let me take you somewhere better than a basement. Just for tonight. You can leave whenever you want. No one will force you. And the dogs come too. Noah didn't answer immediately. He looked at Lee, then down at the smallest puppy curled in his lap. He nodded. Okay. Just for tonight. Jonathan stood, quietly paid the bill, and led them outside. As they walked toward his car, 2 boys, 3 puppies, and a man who had never seen himself as anything but a businessman, something inside him began to shift. He didn't fully understand what was happening yet. But he knew one thing for certain, he was not going to let these boys disappear again. The ride to Jonathan's home was quiet, not because there was nothing to say, but because the boys were watching everything. Lee kept his hands pressed against the window, silently tracing the glass as the city flew past. Noah sat beside him, one hand resting gently on the shoebox where the smallest puppy was curled up beneath a soft towel Jonathan had asked the cafe to spare. The other two puppies lay between them, nestled in the warmth of the car seat, finally still after days of nervous movement. Jonathan glanced at them through the rearview mirror more than once, studying the way the boys looked at the world, as if they had been locked out of it for too long. When they pulled into the underground garage of the building, neither boy moved. Jonathan got out first and opened the rear door, giving them time and space. Noah was the first to step out, clutching the box tightly, his posture tense but alert. Lee followed with two bundled towels holding the remaining pups. As they entered the elevator, Lee whispered, "Is this your building?" Jonathan nodded. "Yes. You'll be safe here." The penthouse was silent when they arrived, large and modern, with clean lines and minimal furniture. For a moment, the boys froze in the doorway, unsure if they were allowed to walk inside. Jonathan gestured gently. "Make yourselves at home. There's food in the kitchen. Water. Blankets. A bathroom through there." Lee inched forward first, setting one puppy down on a soft rug and kneeling beside it. Noah remained near the entrance, scanning the room like he was memorizing every possible exit. "We can sleep on the floor," he said quickly. "We've done that before." Jonathan shook his head. "You'll sleep in real beds. Both of you. No one's asking you to leave in the morning." Still, he noticed they didn't fully relax. He didn't expect them to. The trust they'd given him so far was fragile, earned hour by hour. He left them in the living room and returned a few minutes later with folded towels, soft bedding, and a bag of dog food he had sent Dana to buy. The puppies, though tired, wagged their tails and immediately perked up at the sight of kibble. Lee smiled for the first time, just briefly, and whispered something to the smallest dog before letting it nibble from his palm. Jonathan ordered dinner, nothing fancy, just warm food that didn't come from a wrapper. The boys ate cautiously at first, then with increasing speed, their eyes wide with disbelief when they were offered seconds. Lee asked for a glass of milk and said thank you without being told. Noah still didn't say much, but his body slowly stopped bracing with each passing minute. After dinner, Jonathan handed them both clean clothes, plain sweatpants and soft shirts, and showed them to the guest room. The space had two twin beds, crisp sheets, and a window looking out over the city. Noah stepped inside and stood still, staring at the beds. "You sure this isn't someone else's room?" he asked. Jonathan shook his head. "It's yours now. For as long as you need it." Noah nodded once, still processing. Lee walked straight to one of the beds, climbed in with one of the puppies in his arms, and pulled the blanket up to his chin. "This feels fake," he said quietly. Jonathan stood in the doorway and said, "It's not. You're safe here." He left the light on low and closed the door partway. For a long while, he sat in the living room, looking out at the city that had once been his entire world. The skyline looked the same as it always had, but it didn't feel the same anymore. Somewhere behind that door were two boys who had taught him more in 24 hours than he'd learned in 2 decades of business. He didn't know what would happen next. But he knew one thing without a doubt: this was no longer just a temporary stop for them. Or for him. Something real had begun. The next morning brought the kind of stillness that Jonathan had never known in his home before. Not the sterile silence of empty rooms and untouched furniture, but a soft, breathing quiet, one filled with the weight of presence. He walked into the kitchen to make coffee and paused when he saw a trail of tiny paw prints on the hardwood floor leading from the guest room to the living area. There was a blanket on the couch, a pair of socks too small to belong to him draped over the armrest, and a plastic cup half filled with water near the edge of the table. He didn't feel annoyed. He felt oddly grounded. A few minutes later, Noah emerged from the hallway, already dressed in the clothes Jonathan had given him the day before. He wasn't carrying any of the puppies, but his eyes scanned the kitchen cautiously, as if he wasn't quite sure he was still allowed there. Jonathan didn't say much. He just nodded toward the counter and said, "There's toast and eggs, and orange juice in the fridge." Noah stood in place for a moment, then nodded and walked over slowly. He didn't ask questions, didn't make noise, but he didn't look as tense as he had the day before. Lee appeared not long after, barefoot and carrying the smallest puppy wrapped in a towel like a newborn. He climbed into one of the chairs without hesitation and immediately asked if the dogs were allowed to eat too. Jonathan assured him they were. He placed a bowl on the floor and smiled when all 3 puppies came trotting over, wagging their tails and yipping quietly. It wasn't a perfect morning, but it felt like something real, something solid and human. Later, while the boys watched cartoons for the first time in what must have been months, Jonathan stepped into his office to call his assistant. Dana had already anticipated his questions. She'd contacted Child Services, requested information about the boys, and compiled a report on their mother. Sarah Walsh had been in and out of shelters most of her life. She died of an overdose nearly a year ago. The boys were placed in a group home, then bounced between temporary placements. Each record read colder than the last, numbers and incidents without emotion. According to the file, they had been missing for months. No serious effort had been made to find them. Jonathan stared at the report for a long time. His chest felt tight. He thought of his own childhood, distant and controlled, but never hungry, never afraid, never invisible. He thought about how easily he might have walked past those boys outside his office. How close they had come to vanishing. He told Dana to begin the process of filing for temporary guardianship. "We can't waste time," he said. "They're here now. They need to know they're staying." That afternoon, the boys helped him clean out an old closet to use for the puppies. They didn't talk much while they worked, but there was an ease to their movements, a comfort they hadn't shown before. At one point, Lee sat on the floor and asked Jonathan if the dogs could have names. "Of course," Jonathan said. "They're part of the family now, aren't they?" Lee beamed and began whispering ideas to Noah, who eventually nodded and chose one himself. They named them Milo, Scout, and Daisy. Jonathan wrote the names down on a notepad and promised to order collars that night. Before bed, Lee curled up on the couch with Milo on his chest and asked Jonathan to read him something. Jonathan hesitated, realizing he didn't own any storybooks. So he told them a story from memory, something simple, about a boy who built a treehouse and invited 2 friends to live in it. It wasn't poetic, and his voice cracked once or twice, but Lee listened with wide eyes, and even Noah, sitting at the edge of the rug with Daisy in his lap, leaned in slightly. When the story ended, there was silence for a beat, and then Lee whispered, "I like your voice better than the lady at the shelter." It was the kindest thing Jonathan had heard in years. That night, after the boys were asleep and the dogs had quieted down, Jonathan stood at the window and looked out at the city lights. The skyline had never changed. But now, everything in his world had. He didn't just see buildings anymore. He saw possibility. Responsibility. And something he had forgotten how to name until now, hope. The 5th day began with soft footsteps and the sound of puppy claws tapping gently across the hardwood floor. Jonathan had already been awake for an hour, sitting in his office with a file open on his desk and his coffee long gone cold. He was reviewing paperwork Dana had delivered early that morning, legal steps for temporary custody, statements he would need to make, background checks he'd have to approve. Normally, the thought of bureaucracy would have made him impatient, but now it felt like something worth investing in. He wasn't doing this for optics or image. He was doing it because he couldn't imagine sending Noah and Lee back into a system that had failed them at every turn. He heard a quiet voice in the hallway. Lee was talking to the puppies again, this time explaining how Milo was the brave one, and Scout always gets scared of the vacuum. Jonathan smiled to himself and stepped out of the office just in time to see Lee gently placing a small blue collar around Milo's neck, one of the 3 Jonathan had ordered and had delivered overnight. Lee turned and said proudly, "Now they look real." Jonathan crouched next to him and ruffled the boy's hair. "They've always been real," he said. "But now they have names. And a home. Later that morning, Dana arrived for a scheduled visit, bringing with her a social worker named Grace. Grace had kind eyes and a steady voice. She didn't press the boys with too many questions, but she did ask if they felt safe, if they wanted to stay. Noah gave her a quiet nod, and Lee, holding Scout tightly in his lap, said without hesitation, "This is the first place we've had 2 whole meals a day and nobody yells." Grace glanced at Jonathan and smiled, then made a note in her file. After Grace left, Dana pulled Jonathan aside in the kitchen. "They're going to move quickly on the paperwork," she said. "But they're going to ask why you, someone with no children, no prior interest in fostering, suddenly wants 2 boys and 3 puppies living in your home." Jonathan took a deep breath and said, "Then I'll tell them the truth. I didn't plan this. But I also didn't plan for those boys to look at me like I was the only one left who could help them. That's not something you walk away from." Dana nodded, clearly proud of him, though she said nothing more. That afternoon, Jonathan took the boys to the park. He hadn't set foot in one in years, not since he was a teenager. But seeing Noah quietly reading a plaque near a tree and Lee running through the grass with the puppies brought a strange peace he hadn't felt in decades. They sat on a bench together eating ice cream, the dogs lying at their feet, and Jonathan asked, "What do you guys want to be when you grow up?" Lee answered first. "A vet," he said. "So no dogs ever go hungry or get left behind." Noah looked away, thoughtful, before saying, "I don't know yet. But something where I get to stay." Jonathan nodded and said, "You can take your time." That night, when they returned home, the boys helped him set the table for dinner without being asked. They washed their hands, folded their napkins, and waited until everyone was seated before they began to eat. It wasn't something he'd taught them. It was something they had learned from watching, and perhaps because, for the first time, they wanted to belong. After dinner, Noah stayed behind and asked Jonathan a question he hadn't expected. "Why did you stop that day? You looked like someone who never stops." Jonathan hesitated, then answered honestly. "I didn't know why at the time. I just knew that if I kept walking, I'd regret it for the rest of my life." Noah didn't say anything more, but the way he looked at Jonathan, really looked at him, told him that the answer had landed. When the boys were asleep and the house was still again, Jonathan walked through the apartment and paused by the guest room door. He listened to the even sound of their breathing and the soft rustle of a puppy shifting in its sleep. He didn't open the door. He didn't need to. He already knew what was behind it. And for the first time in his life, it was everything he had ever been missing. The 6th day began differently than the others. A phone call woke Jonathan just after dawn. It was Grace, the social worker, and her voice was calm but firm. She informed him that a relative had come forward, a woman named Celia Walsh, Sarah's younger sister, who had only recently discovered what happened to the boys. According to the report, she lived in another state, worked part-time at a small-town library, and had no prior record of involvement. She was requesting a formal visit to see her nephews. Jonathan sat at the edge of his bed in silence, listening, processing. He hadn't expected anyone to appear. It had never occurred to him that there might be family out there who cared, who simply hadn't known. And now, someone did. Down the hall, he could already hear Lee's voice talking to the puppies and the thump of Scout's tail hitting the floor. The apartment was waking up. The boys had no idea that something was about to shift again, and Jonathan didn't know yet how to tell them. He made breakfast like always, eggs, toast, juice, and tried to keep the routine unchanged. When they sat down to eat, he looked at both of them and said gently, "Someone from your family wants to meet you. Your mom's sister." Noah froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. Lee looked at Jonathan with wide eyes. "Aunt Celia?" he asked. "I think we saw a picture of her once." Jonathan nodded. "She didn't know where you were. But now she does. She's coming here tomorrow." The rest of the day carried a tension that neither boy could fully express. Lee was more quiet than usual, clinging closer to the puppies. Noah asked a few careful questions. Where had she been? Did she want to take them away? Why now? Jonathan answered honestly. I don't know what she wants yet. But I do know you'll get to decide what you want too. The next morning, Celia arrived. She was in her early 30s, with soft brown hair pulled into a braid and eyes that looked like Sarah's. She entered the apartment nervously, wringing her hands. The moment the boys saw her, there was a pause so heavy it seemed to pull the air out of the room. Then Lee ran forward and wrapped his arms around her. She dropped to her knees and held him tightly, tears running down her face. Noah stood back, unsure, watching them. Celia reached out to him too, but gently, giving him space. You don't have to trust me yet, she said. But I promise I didn't know. If I had, her voice broke. Noah didn't move, but his eyes softened. They spent the afternoon together in the living room, telling stories about their mom, sharing photos Celia had brought in a small box. Jonathan watched from the hallway, not wanting to intrude. He wasn't sure what role he was playing now. He had stepped into the space of protector, caretaker, maybe even father figure. But now a blood relative had come. And that changed things. Or it might. After Celia left, the apartment was quieter than usual. The boys didn't talk much. That evening, as Jonathan was folding laundry in the guest room, Noah came in and stood silently in the doorway. She's nice, he said. Jonathan nodded. Yes, she is. Noah stared at the floor. But I don't want to leave. Jonathan stopped what he was doing. You might not have to, he said. We'll figure it out together. Noah looked up. Can we stay even if she stays too? Jonathan paused, then smiled. If that's what you want, then yes. That night, Lee asked if Celia could visit again soon. Jonathan said yes, of course. But deep down, he wondered how this would unfold. He didn't want to lose them. He knew that much. And yet, he also wanted what was best for them, even if that meant stepping aside. But when Lee fell asleep on the couch next to Milo and Noah sat beside him and asked if they could keep calling it home, Jonathan felt something settle in his chest. Maybe family didn't have to be one thing or another. Maybe it could be both. The seventh day began with rain tapping softly against the windows, drawing streaks across the glass and making the apartment feel quieter than usual. Jonathan stood in the kitchen, stirring oatmeal, while Milo and Scout snored softly beneath the table. It was still early, but he had barely slept. The thought of Celia lingered in his mind all night. Her presence had been warm and genuine, and there was no denying that she cared deeply about the boys. But caring wasn't the only thing that mattered. Stability, safety, connection, those had to be earned. And Jonathan had watched them slowly grow over the past week, not through dramatic promises, but through routines, laughter, and the way Lee always waited for him to sit before starting dinner. When the boys woke up, they acted more like themselves than he expected. Lee asked for extra cinnamon in his oatmeal. Noah walked into the room without hesitation, gave the puppies their food, and casually told Jonathan about a dream he'd had. There was no fear in their eyes, no sign that they were bracing for loss. Jonathan didn't know if that meant they felt secure or if they were just used to being let down slowly. Later that morning, Celia arrived again, this time carrying a bag of books and a stack of neatly folded clothes she said used to belong to Noah. She didn't try to hug them right away. She just sat on the floor, opened a book, and started reading aloud. Lee curled up beside her. Noah sat a few feet away, pretending not to listen, but he didn't leave. Jonathan stayed back, watching from the hallway again, but not out of discomfort. He was observing the kind of connection that wasn't trying to replace him, but rather, grow alongside him. After lunch, Celia asked if they could all take a walk. The rain had stopped and the sky was clearing, so they walked together down to the park. The boys ran ahead with the puppies, chasing after leaves and laughing in the way only children who feel momentarily free can. Celia walked beside Jonathan quietly until she finally said, "I didn't come to take them away. I came to see if I could belong in their lives too." Jonathan looked over at her, his expression calm. "That's not what most people would assume. You've shown a lot of grace walking into something already in motion." She smiled, tired but sincere. "I've spent most of my life watching from the outside. I don't want to do that anymore. And I know I'm not the one who kept them safe these last months." "You did." He didn't respond right away, but he appreciated her honesty. There was no competition in her tone, only care. That evening, they all ate dinner together for the first time. The table was loud with conversation. Lee told Celia about how Milo once sneezed in the middle of a nap and scared Scout so badly that he knocked over the water bowl. Noah corrected him on the details. Jonathan just listened. After the dishes were cleared, Celia prepared to leave. Lee walked her to the door, hugging her tightly without being asked. Noah said goodbye, and this time, there was no hesitation. Later that night, Jonathan found Noah in the living room, sitting with a blanket draped over his legs and Daisy nestled at his side. The boy looked up at him and asked quietly, "If she stays in town, could she maybe live near here?" Jonathan nodded. "We can help her find a place." Noah didn't say anything more. He just nodded and turned back to the dog. As Jonathan walked back to his room, he realized something that settled into his chest like truth. Family didn't have to be divided into categories of blood and guardianship. It could be layered, messy, flexible. It could be born in strange, unplanned moments and still grow into something solid. It could stretch to include new people, without letting go of the ones who were already there. And somehow, that made it stronger. Not weaker. The 8th day didn't begin with a dramatic shift or any urgent phone call. It began with sunlight slowly warming the edges of the apartment and the smell of pancakes drifting from the kitchen, where Jonathan stood flipping batter with more confidence than he'd had a week earlier. Lee was already at the table, talking animatedly to Milo, who was curled up under the chair. Noah wandered in a few minutes later, rubbing his eyes and dragging a blanket behind him, his usual quiet replaced with a soft, sleepy smile. There was something different in the air, an ease that had taken root. The boys no longer acted like guests or temporary residents. They moved through the apartment like it was theirs, and Jonathan realized that in every meaningful way, it was. Later that morning, Celia returned, not for a visit, but for a conversation. She sat with Jonathan on the balcony while the boys played with the puppies on the rug inside. The city hummed softly below them, but the moment felt distant from all of that. Celia held a folder in her hands, the edges worn from being opened and closed repeatedly. She passed it to Jonathan without speaking. Inside was a signed statement relinquishing any claim of sole guardianship. Along with it was a request for shared custody, an official document that, if approved, would make Jonathan a permanent legal guardian alongside her. He looked up at her, surprised. Celia met his gaze calmly. "You earned your place in their lives. I don't want to undo that. I want to build with it." Jonathan didn't speak for a moment. He had prepared himself for a future where he might have to step aside or fight to stay. He hadn't prepared for generosity. He hadn't expected someone to recognize, without ego or resistance, that family could mean cooperation. Finally, he nodded and said, "Thank you." And he meant it more than anything he had ever said in a boardroom. That afternoon, they all went to a community adoption event, not for the boys, but for the puppies. It had been Lee's idea to help find other animals loving homes the way theirs had found one. They brought a donation of toys and blankets, and Lee insisted on giving each dog a treat himself. Noah helped one of the volunteers set up water bowls and never once looked uncomfortable. Jonathan watched them both from across the field and felt something rare stir inside him, a quiet, profound pride that wasn't about accomplishments or recognition, but about being part of something real. That evening, Jonathan, Celia, the boys, and the now considerably calmer Puppies sat around the dinner table, eating homemade spaghetti and laughing about how Daisy had tried to eat an entire sock. It wasn't the kind of dinner Jonathan had envisioned for his life when he'd built his empire. It was far better. There was noise and mess and laughter that didn't feel forced. When dinner ended, Lee asked if they could take a picture, all of them together. Jonathan set up his phone, and just before the timer clicked, Noah leaned into his side and said, "We're staying, right?" Jonathan looked at him and replied, "You already have." That night, long after the boys were asleep and the city had quieted, Jonathan stood at the same window where he had once measured his success by how high he'd climbed. The skyline was unchanged, but now it was just background. His view had shifted. The real victory wasn't the company or the property or the legacy. It was the two boys asleep in the next room. It was the family growing out of circumstance and kindness. It was the chance to be chosen, not because he was powerful, but because he had stayed. As the moonlight spilled across the floor, Milo lifted his head from the foot of Jonathan's bed, then dropped it again with a sigh. Jonathan smiled and whispered into the dark, "We're home." The ending of this story resonates not because everything turns out perfectly, but because it feels earned. Jonathan Reed's journey isn't about sudden redemption or dramatic transformation, it's about gradual, conscious change born out of compassion he didn't know he was capable of. What makes the conclusion powerful is that it honors the complexity of real relationships. It doesn't erase pain or past losses, but it shows that healing can come in unexpected ways, often through the quiet decision to stay, to care, to show up again and again. By choosing to build a life with Noah, Lee, and even Celia, Jonathan doesn't lose himself, he becomes someone better. The ending is hopeful, but grounded. It doesn't promise that everything will be easy, but it shows that love, chosen and nurtured, is stronger than anything wealth alone can offer. That, to me, is the most moving kind of ending, the one that reflects not fantasy, but what's possible when a heart truly opens. Henry Mathis didn't believe in second chances, until a barefoot little girl holding a baby outside a hospital made him stop walking, and for the first time in years, start feeling. Henry Mathis believed in results, not emotions. He built his empire through discipline, efficiency, and an unwavering belief that logic always trumped empathy. His schedule was meticulously planned, his conversations calculated, and his compassion, non-existent, as far as he was concerned. He walked through the city like a man on a mission, never slowing down, never looking around. So when he approached the hospital that Thursday afternoon, it was with the same intention he always carried, to finalize a medical partnership that would expand his company's pharmaceutical reach and increase quarterly profits. He wasn't there to notice anyone. And yet, for reasons he couldn't explain, he did. Near the stone steps leading to the hospital entrance, Henry saw a small shape out of the corner of his eye. A little girl, barely 6, if that, was sitting motionless, holding what looked like a bundle of blankets. At first, he thought she was waiting for someone. But as he drew closer, he noticed her eyes, wide, clear, and exhausted. Her arms were tightly wrapped around an infant swaddled in a pink blanket, the baby's tiny face just barely visible through the folds. The girl's blonde hair was tangled, and her thin frame looked too small for the task of carrying anyone, let alone protecting another human being. Henry stopped walking. It wasn't in his nature to stop. But something about the stillness of the child, her silence in the chaos of the hospital entrance, made him pause. She wasn't crying. She wasn't begging. She was just, holding on. He crouched slowly, keeping his voice calm. "Are you all right? Are you lost?" he asked. His voice, usually firm and commanding, softened without him realizing it. The girl didn't flinch, but she looked up at him with a tired expression far too old for her face. "No. We're not lost," she said quietly. "My sister needs milk. Mommy's in a coma." Henry blinked, caught off guard by the bluntness of her answer. He looked at the baby more closely now. The child was no older than a few months, cheeks pale, eyes closed, one tiny hand peeking from the blanket. The girl held her like she'd done it before, like this wasn't the first time she'd had to be the adult. "Where's your father?" he asked gently. "We don't have one," the girl said. "He left when I was little." "Then Mommy had Rose." "That's her name." Her voice trembled slightly, but she didn't cry. "When Mommy got hurt in the crash, they took us to the children's place. But they didn't take care of Rose. They just left her in a room. So I waited until they weren't watching, and I took her. I had to." Henry felt something unfamiliar stir in his chest, something sharp and tight that refused to go away. He stood and looked around. People passed by without noticing the scene unfolding at their feet. A security guard at the door eyed him but said nothing. The girl, meanwhile, adjusted the blanket around her sister and tried to keep her steady. Henry knew what he should do: alert child services, step back, let the system handle it. But his feet didn't move. Instead, he reached into his coat, pulled out his phone, and called his assistant. "Cancel the meeting," he said quietly. "I've got something more important." When he looked down again, the girl was watching him, unsure whether to trust him or run. He offered his hand. "Let's go inside. Just to get your sister warm. And fed. You can hold her the whole time if you want." She stared for a moment, then nodded slowly. Her fingers clutched the infant tightly as she stood. Henry led them through the doors and into the hospital, not knowing where this was going, only that for once, he wasn't walking away. Inside the hospital, Henry guided the little girl toward the reception desk, but instead of announcing her presence to the staff, he gently steered her into a quieter waiting area tucked off to the side. The space was warmer, quieter, with soft lighting and a few cushioned chairs that looked rarely used. He didn't want to overwhelm her or the baby, not yet. She sat down carefully, cradling her sister as if the world might still try to pull her away. Henry crouched again, making eye contact and speaking with a tone he barely recognized as his own. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated, as though weighing whether to speak. Then she said, "Lily. And this is Rose." Henry nodded, storing the names like they mattered more than anything else on his calendar. He pulled out his phone again and made another call, not to his board or to a driver, but directly to a pediatrician he had worked with during a corporate-sponsored program. He didn't explain everything, only said he needed someone he trusted, urgently. Within minutes, a nurse appeared at the edge of the waiting area and took in the sight of Lily and the baby without asking questions. Henry stood and met her gaze. "Her name is Rose. She hasn't eaten. She's cold. She's been in a bad place." The nurse nodded and gently approached Lily. Lily looked up, clearly torn between fear and instinct. The nurse crouched beside her and smiled. "You can stay with her the whole time, sweetheart. No one's taking her away." Lily finally allowed the nurse to examine the baby while still keeping Rose in her arms. Henry stepped back and watched as Rose was checked for vital signs, her temperature taken, her breathing monitored. The baby didn't fuss much. She was tired, underfed, and far too quiet for her age. While the examination continued, Henry spoke with the doctor in the hallway. He described what little he knew and asked what needed to be done immediately. The pediatrician, a calm woman named Dr. Keener, explained that Rose needed formula, warmth, and observation for a few days. "She's fragile," the doctor said softly. "But this little girl, Lily, she's done something extraordinary. She's kept that baby alive under conditions that would break most adults." Henry said nothing, but inside, something shifted. He walked back to the waiting area with a purpose he hadn't felt in years. Lily sat alone again, bottle now in hand, feeding Rose with quiet concentration. Her fingers were still trembling, but she kept her focus on her sister, brushing her hair aside when it got in the way. Henry didn't interrupt. He waited until the bottle was empty, until Rose had dozed off in her arms, before speaking again. "Do you want to come with me? Just for tonight. Somewhere safe, warm, where you won't have to hide." Lily didn't answer right away. She looked at the baby, then up at him. "Only if I can hold her the whole time." Henry nodded. "That's a promise." An hour later, after filing a temporary notice with the hospital and agreeing to bring Rose back for observation, Henry helped Lily into the back seat of his car. She refused to sit in a booster seat, too afraid to let go of her sister, so he buckled her in as she was, wrapped tightly around the baby, still alert, still unsure. As the city moved past the windows in neon streaks, Henry sat silently in the front seat, his mind trying to make sense of what was happening. Nothing in his life had prepared him for this. And yet, as he glanced at Lily in the rearview mirror, her head tilted protectively over Rose's, he knew with absolute clarity that whatever came next, he couldn't let her go. Not now. Not ever. When they arrived at Henry's apartment, Lily hesitated before stepping out of the car. She held Rose tightly, her arms locked around the baby as if releasing her would mean losing everything. Henry opened the door for her but didn't rush her. He waited quietly as she looked up at the tall building, the glass exterior glowing under the city lights. It didn't look like a place a child belonged, and she clearly sensed it. Still, after a few moments, she climbed out, barefoot and cautious, her clothes wrinkled and her face unreadable. Henry led her through the lobby without drawing attention. The concierge started to ask something, but Henry gave a quiet shake of the head. No questions. Upstairs, his penthouse looked even more sterile than usual. The sleek furniture, minimal decoration, and cold lighting stood in stark contrast to the warmth of the child clinging to the infant in her arms. Henry noticed it immediately and realized how absurd it was, this fortress of wealth and power, completely unprepared for something so human. He led Lily to the guest room, the only one with a bed that wasn't draped in documents or devices. She walked in and stopped at the doorway, surveying the space. Henry gently offered, "You can sleep here. I'll be right down the hall." She looked at the bed, the blanket, the window, and then back at him. "Is there a lock?" she asked softly. He blinked. "On the inside?" She nodded. "Yes. There is." She walked inside without another word. Henry stepped out and let her settle. He didn't want to overwhelm her, not after everything she had just done. In the kitchen, he made warm milk, unsure if it was more for her or the baby. He returned a few minutes later and found Lily sitting on the bed, still holding Rose, the baby now half asleep. She accepted the milk but didn't drink right away. "I'm not supposed to talk to strangers," she said quietly. "That's smart," Henry replied. "You shouldn't. But I want to help. And I won't do anything without your permission." She looked at him again, still studying him with the kind of suspicion most adults couldn't hold. "Why did you stop?" she asked. "You didn't have to." He considered his answer carefully. "I don't know. But I'm glad I did." That night, Lily slept in her clothes, curled on one side of the bed with Rose resting on her chest. Henry watched from the doorway for a few seconds before quietly turning off the light. He stayed up late, sitting in his office, searching hospital records, Child Protective Services databases, and anything else he could find. He called his assistant and asked her to discreetly locate any information on Madison Gray, the name Lily had mentioned as her mother. Within an hour, he had confirmation. A young woman by that name had been admitted 2 months ago following a severe car crash. She was in a coma and had no known relatives willing to take the children. The girls had been placed in emergency care and eventually in a foster home. The report mentioned Lily escaping. No one had followed up. No one had looked for her. To the system, she had simply vanished. Henry stared at the screen in disbelief. He couldn't imagine a world where a 6-year-old could disappear and not set off alarms. And yet here she was, in his home, because she'd done what the system couldn't, protect her sister. He leaned back in his chair, exhausted but unable to rest. The weight of responsibility was unfamiliar. He was used to risk, but calculated risk, measurable outcomes, stock prices. This was something else. Lily and Rose were not liabilities or assets. They were children. Real, vulnerable, and in this moment, his responsibility. He knew that no matter what happened next, he had already crossed a line. There would be no returning to the life he knew before this night. And somehow, he didn't want to. The following morning began with a silence that felt different than the one Henry was used to. It wasn't the cold, calculated quiet of an empty apartment before the day's first call. It was cautious, tense, and heavy with unspoken questions. He found Lily already awake, sitting upright in the guest bed with Rose still bundled in her arms. Her hair was messy, her eyes alert but wary. She hadn't moved from the spot where she'd fallen asleep. Henry knocked softly before entering, holding 2 slices of toast and a cup of warm milk. She didn't say anything as he stepped inside, but she didn't turn him away either. That was progress. He placed the tray on the nightstand and asked gently if Rose had eaten. Lily nodded. She had some of the bottle you made. Then she added, she didn't cry much last night. Henry sat in the chair near the window, careful not to get too close. You did good, Lily. You kept her safe. And warm. She looked at him with a mixture of pride and suspicion. I had to. They don't care in that place. They kept saying someone would come. But no one came. Her voice cracked only at the end, but she quickly straightened herself and kissed Rose on the forehead. I'm not going back, she added. Even if they find me. Henry didn't offer empty reassurances. Instead, he said what he meant. You're not going anywhere right now. You're safe here. That seemed to calm her slightly. She took the toast in one hand while still holding her sister with the other, eating slowly, methodically, as if she was used to making every bite last. Henry asked her if she had any allergies, and she shook her head. He didn't press her with questions, but she eventually offered fragments on her own. She talked about the day her mother didn't come home. About a strange man in a suit who came to get them. About the shelter that smelled like bleach and old food. About how babies cried all night and how some of the older kids pushed her. About how no one noticed when she waited near the door and left with Rose in her arms. By late morning, Henry's assistant, Dana, arrived with clothes, diapers, formula, and a few toys. She didn't ask questions either. She had worked for Henry long enough to know when something mattered more than it seemed. Lily flinched when she saw Dana at first but relaxed when the woman smiled and handed her a soft pink sweater. I thought you might like this one, Dana said. Lily took it and nodded, though she didn't change right away. Trust, Henry realized, was going to be earned inch by inch. In the early afternoon, Dr. Keener arrived to check on Rose. Lily didn't want to let go, so the doctor worked around her. Rose's weight was slightly low, but her reflexes were strong and her heart was steady. She's resilient, the doctor said quietly to Henry. And so is the one carrying her. Later that day, Lily finally explored the apartment. She didn't run or skip or ask for anything. She simply walked slowly from room to room, still holding Rose, still measuring the space as if it might vanish at any moment. She stopped in the kitchen, eyeing the counter filled with bottles and sterilizing equipment Dana had set up. Is this all for her? She asked. Henry nodded. Yes. Just in case you need it. Lily bit her lip and said, they never had this stuff where we were. I had to make bottles with cold water. He didn't know what to say to that. So he just nodded again, silently promising she'd never have to do that again. That evening, as Henry sat across from her at the dinner table, he noticed how her posture had changed, less guarded, more present. She ate half a bowl of soup and watched him closely the entire time. Finally, she asked, "What do you do? Are you rich or something?" The question caught him off guard, but he answered truthfully. "I run a big company. I used to think that mattered most." Lily frowned thoughtfully. "But now?" He looked at her and then at Rose, sleeping beside her in a baby carrier Dana had brought. "Now I'm not so sure." Lily didn't respond. She just kept eating, slowly, as if digesting more than just food. Henry knew the next steps wouldn't be simple, but for the first time in years, he didn't feel alone in the quiet. The fifth day began with rain streaking down the tall windows of Henry's apartment, softening the edges of the skyline and making the usually sharp, bright view look almost muted. Lily stood by the glass, her forehead pressed lightly against the pane, watching water race toward the bottom in thin streams. She wasn't holding Rose for once, just watching, her small hands folded in front of her like she was waiting for something she couldn't quite name. Henry walked in carrying a fresh bottle and noticed how quiet she was. "She's still sleeping," Lily said without turning around. "She had a good night." Henry nodded, placing the bottle on the counter. "That's because you've been doing everything right," he replied. Lily finally turned to face him and hesitated before asking, "Do you think my mom will wake up?" The question landed with the weight of everything she hadn't said since she arrived. Henry walked over slowly and sat at the edge of the nearby couch, not pushing her to sit with him. "I hope so," he said honestly. "She's still fighting. And the doctors are doing everything they can." Lily gave a small nod and then looked back out the window. She used to sing to Rose. Every night. Even if she was tired. She'd sing the same song. And Rose would fall asleep in seconds. Her voice trembled just once, but she blinked away the emotion. She loved her so much. Both of us. Even when she was working 3 jobs and we only had toast for dinner. Henry listened without interruption. Each detail Lily gave was more than just a memory, it was proof that someone had loved her, fiercely and without conditions. It made the entire situation feel even heavier. Madison Gray wasn't an absent mother. She had fought. She had done what she could. And now, she was lying unconscious while her daughter tried to protect what little remained of their world. Henry couldn't imagine what it would feel like to carry that kind of weight at 6 years old. Later that afternoon, Henry received a call from Evelyn, one of his most trusted legal advisors. She had found the documentation regarding Lily and Rose's placement in state care. The report was vague, filled with formal language and minimal follow-up. There had been no official search ordered after Lily's disappearance. The assumption had been that she would eventually return or be found by authorities. Evelyn also discovered that no immediate family had come forward to claim custody. The only distant relative, a paternal uncle, had declined involvement. That knowledge created a strange mix of relief and outrage in Henry. How could a system lose track of a child so easily? How could no one even try to look? Evelyn's voice turned more serious. "If you want to take temporary guardianship," she said, "we can begin the process today. But it's going to involve some visibility. Paperwork. Oversight." Henry didn't hesitate. "Do whatever it takes," he said. "I'm not letting them go back to a shelter." That evening, after Rose had been bathed and changed, Lily sat on the couch beside Henry with a coloring book open in front of her. She wasn't drawing anything in particular, just soft lines across the page, like it helped her think. "You're different from the other adults," she said suddenly. "Most people ask what happened. You didn't." Henry leaned back in the chair, arms crossed loosely. "I figured you'd tell me when you were ready," he replied. She nodded slowly, satisfied with the answer. "They told me at the shelter that families break," she added after a pause. "But maybe they don't always stay broken." It wasn't a question, but Henry treated it like one. "No," he said quietly. "Sometimes, someone shows up when you don't expect them. And they help put the pieces back together. Lily looked over at him and smiled, small, but genuine. It was the first time he'd seen her face soften like that. Then she picked up a purple crayon and began to draw again, this time forming shapes instead of lines. Henry didn't ask what it was. He didn't need to. He just sat there, watching her and listening to Rose breathe softly in the carrier nearby, and realized this moment, quiet and unscripted, was more valuable than anything he'd ever built with a pen or a contract. The 6th day began before sunrise. Henry was already awake, sitting at the kitchen counter with a mug of coffee growing cold in his hands, while the city outside still dozed under a pale blue haze. He hadn't slept much, but it wasn't from stress or exhaustion the way it used to be in his old life. It was a new kind of restlessness, the kind that came from caring too deeply and not knowing what tomorrow would bring. He heard soft footsteps behind him and turned to see Lily, barefoot and wrapped in a blanket, her hair tousled and her eyes still heavy with sleep. She didn't speak right away but walked to the refrigerator and poured herself a glass of water without asking. That, in itself, was progress. Henry motioned toward the chair across from him, and she sat down, keeping the blanket over her knees. "Rose is still sleeping," she said. "She had a little cough last night, but it stopped." He nodded, making a mental note to mention it to Dr. Keener when she came by for the scheduled checkup. Lily sipped her water and then looked at him. "You're not like the people in the office. You don't wear your watch anymore." He glanced at his wrist and realized she was right. The heavy silver timepiece that had once dictated his day had been sitting untouched on his desk all week. "I guess I lost track of time," he said, and Lily gave a tiny, almost imperceptible smile. Later that morning, Dr. Keener arrived with a gentle knock and her usual calm presence. Lily allowed her to examine Rose without hesitation this time, even stepping back a little to give her room. Rose's vitals were stable, her color better, and the doctor noted her growing strength with cautious optimism. After the exam, Dr. Keener sat with Henry in the living room while Lily fed Rose. "They're settling into a rhythm," she said. "But you know this can't remain informal forever. CPS will catch up eventually, especially if there's been a missing child report." Henry nodded, already expecting that reality. "We've started the paperwork for temporary guardianship," he said. "I want it to be official. I want them protected." Dr. Keener hesitated, then asked, "Do you understand what that means, Henry? Not just legally, but emotionally? These girls will need more than safety. They'll need permanence. They'll need presence." Henry looked over at Lily, who was now lying on the floor beside Rose, letting the baby curl her hand around one of her fingers. "I've spent most of my life building things that don't matter anymore," he said. "This does." That afternoon, Evelyn stopped by with the official forms. Lily watched as Henry signed them at the kitchen table, one after the other, his pen steady and deliberate. She didn't ask what the papers were for, but when he looked up and caught her watching, he said, "These are so I can make sure no one takes you or Rose away without going through me first." Lily blinked, then nodded, as if something inside her had finally shifted. She didn't say thank you. She just walked over and hugged him, not tightly, not dramatically, but with intention. And that was more than enough. As night fell, Henry noticed how quiet the apartment had become, not from absence but from peace. Lily had tucked Rose into the crib Dana had brought earlier that day, a soft lullaby playing quietly in the background. Then she came to Henry and handed him one of her drawings, a picture of a tall building with a little girl and a baby in the window, and a man standing next to them. "It's us," she said simply. "But I made the building look warmer." Henry took the drawing and looked at it for a long time. The lines weren't perfect, and the colors bled at the edges, but it was the most honest piece of art he had ever seen. That night, as he turned off the lights and made one last check on the girls, Henry realized that for the first time in his life, the silence around him didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like home. The seventh day began with a sense of waiting, the kind that comes when something is shifting just beneath the surface. Henry could feel it as he watched Lily eat her cereal with one hand while holding Rose with the other, her movements automatic now, like they had always lived like this. She had grown more confident in the past few days, not in a loud or playful way, but in the small quiet choices she made, pouring her own milk, brushing her hair without being asked, folding Rose's tiny clothes and stacking them neatly on the dresser in the guest room. Henry noticed these things the way someone notices sunlight through closed blinds. He didn't comment, but each detail stayed with him. That morning, he received a message from the hospital. Madison Gray, Lily and Rose's mother, had shown signs of responsiveness. She had opened her eyes briefly during the night. A nurse had recorded her attempting to mouth words. Though she wasn't fully awake, it was the most hopeful update since her accident. Henry sat on the edge of his bed staring at the message for several minutes before deciding what to do next. He called Dana and asked her to clear his schedule. Then he walked to the guest room where Lily was changing Rose's diaper and gently told her the news. Lily froze, her hands still. "She's waking up?" she asked, not quite believing it. Henry nodded. "It's early, but yes. They think it's the beginning." He offered to take her to the hospital. She didn't answer right away. Her eyes flickered to Rose, then back to Henry. "Only if she can come with us," she said. He promised she could. Within the hour, they were in the car, the city blurring past them under a soft, overcast sky. Henry drove in silence, glancing occasionally in the mirror to see Lily looking out the window, her arms wrapped protectively around Rose as if bracing for the worst even as hope crept in. When they arrived, the nurse greeted them at the ICU doors and led them through. Lily's steps slowed as they approached the room, and when they finally reached the glass panel outside Madison's bed, she stopped completely. Henry placed a hand on her shoulder but didn't say anything. Inside, Madison lay still, but her eyes were partially open. A soft beep echoed from the monitors. Her body was thinner than Lily remembered, her skin pale and fragile, but she was there. Present. Real. Lily took a step forward, then another, and finally entered the room while Henry waited just outside. Lily stood at her mother's bedside and said nothing for several minutes. Then she leaned in, gently touched Madison's hand, and whispered, "I didn't leave her, Mom. I kept her safe." Madison's eyelids fluttered, and her mouth moved slightly, no words, but recognition sparked faintly in her expression. Lily kept talking, barely above a whisper, telling her mother how Rose had cried, how they had hidden, how someone kind found them. "His name is Henry," she added. "He didn't ask questions. He just helped." When Lily returned to the hallway, she looked up at Henry with red-rimmed eyes but a calm expression. "She knew me," she said. "I think she did." Henry nodded, placing a hand over hers briefly. "That matters." Later, as they sat in the hospital cafe with Rose sleeping in a carrier between them, Lily said something unexpected. "If she gets better, I think she'll need help too. Like me." Henry watched her for a moment, realizing again how much weight this child had carried. "You won't have to carry it alone anymore," he said. "Whatever happens next, I'm here." She didn't speak, but her hand reached out and held his on the table, small fingers curled over his knuckles. It wasn't dramatic or tearful. It was quiet and steady, the kind of connection born not from grand gestures, but from choosing to stay. That evening, back at the apartment, Lily drew another picture and placed it on Henry's desk without a word. It showed a hospital bed, a window, and a girl holding a baby while someone stood nearby with a hand on her shoulder. At the top, in careful handwriting, it said, "We're not alone now." Henry stared at it long after Lily had gone to bed, wondering how a drawing from a 6-year-old could feel more profound than anything he'd ever signed in his office. On the 8th day, everything changed in a way that didn't feel dramatic or loud, but like a shift in gravity, subtle, irreversible, and deeply felt. The morning began like the others, with sunlight stretching softly across the floor and the scent of warm oatmeal drifting through the apartment. Lily had begun to wake up without needing to check her surroundings first. She moved with quiet certainty now, feeding Rose, brushing her hair, asking for things she needed without hesitation. There was no fear in her voice anymore. There was steadiness, a rhythm that had taken root in just a week but felt like it had always been there. Henry watched her carry Rose to the couch, placing the baby in the small bouncer seat with practiced hands. He realized that she hadn't once asked if they would have to leave. The question had faded, replaced by something unspoken but understood. This was home now, and she believed it. It wasn't something Henry had declared. It had become true because he had shown her every day that he was staying. That afternoon, they went back to the hospital. Madison had woken more fully that morning. The doctor had called to say she was conscious, though weak, and beginning to speak in short phrases. Henry let Lily walk into the room on her own. He stood outside again, hands in his pockets, listening to the gentle sounds of machines humming and Rose gurgling quietly in the carrier. Inside, Lily sat by her mother and took her hand. Madison turned her head slowly, her voice barely audible but full of emotion. She said Lily's name. Lily's reply was calm and certain, "I'm okay. I took care of Rose. And we're safe now." They stayed longer this time. Madison was still recovering, but her awareness was clear, and the bond between her and Lily was unmistakable. When Henry finally stepped in, Madison looked at him with tired, grateful eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, and he nodded without needing to respond. There was a moment of mutual understanding, quiet and deeply human. They both had one thing in common: they had tried to protect these children, each in their own way, and somehow they had managed to meet in the middle of that effort. In the days that followed, Madison began regaining her strength. The hospital team started to plan for her rehabilitation, and a social worker entered the conversation, suggesting a long-term care plan that included monitored support for the family. But when asked what she wanted for her daughters, Madison gave a response no one expected. She looked at Henry and said, "If anything happens to me again, they need someone who won't disappear. Someone they already trust. I want him there." Henry didn't speak. He simply reached across the table and took the document the social worker slid forward. When he signed it, it wasn't as a businessman securing another asset. It was as a man choosing to belong to someone, for real, with all the responsibility and love that came with it. Months passed. Madison recovered slowly but steadily, and she remained a part of Lily and Rose's lives. She came over often, shared dinners, sometimes stayed the night in the guest room that used to be only Lily's. It wasn't a traditional arrangement, but it worked, built on trust and care, not control. Lily started school again. Henry walked her to the gate on her first day. Rose began to giggle every time Henry picked her up. Dana added a photo of the girls to the front of her planner without being asked. One evening, as Henry tucked Lily in, she asked him quietly, "Are you going to be my dad forever?" He didn't answer right away. He sat on the edge of her bed, brushing a curl from her face. "Do you want me to be?" She nodded without hesitation. "Yes. You already are." He leaned down and kissed her forehead. "Then I will be." That night, Henry stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker below. His reflection in the glass looked different now, not harder or older, but fuller. He had spent so long chasing purpose in the form of progress, in numbers and titles. But purpose had found him in a grocery store aisle, wrapped in the arms of a little girl holding her baby sister. And now, finally, he understood what it meant to build something that couldn't be bought. Something that mattered. A family. A future. A life. This ending is not just a conclusion to a story, it's the result of a deeply personal transformation. Henry Mathis, a man from a world built on numbers, control, and distance, undergoes a change that doesn't happen in a single moment and isn't portrayed as a miracle. It grows, through actions, through quiet decisions, through trust that's earned one day at a time. What makes this ending especially powerful is that no one becomes perfect. Madison doesn't magically recover, Henry doesn't save everyone with one gesture, and Lily doesn't suddenly become a carefree child. This is a story about how a real family can be formed not through biology, but through choice, deliberate, repeated, and tested by time. The ending is honest, without drama, but filled with deep hope. And that makes it stronger than any fairy tale. Because this isn't everything is perfect. This is we're going to stay together, no matter what. And that means everything.